Morning Fairview Church. We'll be in Genesis 1, 26 through 28 again this morning. I'll read our scripture for us and then pray. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth." Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. For a long time now, I have been fascinated by movies about space exploration. Movies and TV shows. Ever since I was a kid, there were these reruns when I was a kid growing up of this 1960s show called Lost in Space, which some of you may remember that, or some of you may have seen the rebooted version that recently came out a few years ago that has been really popular on Netflix. But Lost in Space is one of those shows, but there are all kinds of movies about space as well that I've always enjoyed. Going back to like Apollo 13, like movies that are actually true stories about space exploration, or even those that are like thinking about exploration and invention, all the way to, I'm thinking of like Interstellar or First Man or, Gravity, and all these kinds of movies are popular because there is something about space that just ignites the imagination, right? It's why some people even now will get online and they'll want to look at the landscape of Mars, the surface of Mars through the eyes of the Land Rover, or to see what's going on, or like we keep sending things to the moon, or if we'll put people back on the moon at some point. And so it's space exploration, which is one aspect that is just fascinating. But even Earth exploration is interesting. One of my favorite books in the past 10 years or so has been a book called In the Kingdom of Ice. And it's by a man named Hampton Sides. And he basically tells this story of this ill-fated voyage to the North Pole by this ship filled with all of these explorers who wanted to get to the North Pole. And they thought that they would get through the polar sea and eventually be able to find some kind of oasis up at the North Pole. They were sadly disappointed. But the story is just fascinating, the grit and the determination that these men had. But then you think about, even as school kids, we read stories about Lewis and Clark, or we read fantasy stories about journeying to the center of the earth. And maybe you like some of those documentaries that show what life is like deep down in the deepest parts of the ocean, or what could drive someone to want to climb Mount Everest, or to be to hear the story of the certain person who's like the first to arrive at a certain island, or the men who trekked across Antarctica. Whatever it may be, there's something about exploration that ignites in us a sense of wonder. For a lot of people in our world, when we talk about exploration, they immediately think, yes, because humans are awesome, right? It's all a testament to human ingenuity and to human brilliance and the invincibility of the human spirit. And it just says something about how amazing human beings are, that we have this power and that we're so inventive, and that, the human intellect can develop new technology that will make the world a better place, or help us to cross boundaries we've never been able to cross before. But I would say, according to the Bible, that our inventions and our explorations, yes, they are a testament to how amazing human beings are, to the nature of humanity, but they're also a testament to the goodness of the world that God has given us. And they're a testament, that human brilliance is a testimony not just to humanity, but also to the reality that when we do things like that, we are reflecting God. We are created in the image of a wise and creative God. We were made in the image of a creative God who rules over the world with wisdom. And the reason we love the thrill of discovery is because God made us that way. Just think about it. In the first chapters of Genesis, we don't see God placing the first human pair in the Garden of Eden just to keep it the way it was. No, when God put Adam and Eve there, he put them there to work the garden. We looked at work a couple of weeks ago, but what does it mean to work the garden? Well, at some level, it means to cultivate it, right? To make something of it, to discover and to bring forth the hidden potentials that are there in the ground and the way that the world works, and to work with the groove of the world in order to create and to cultivate, just as God is the creator of all things. So working the garden, well, it means to receive the world that God has given to us and then to rule wisely over it as people made in God's image. We are made in the image of a God who reigns over the world with goodness and love, who is creative and wise in what he has done. And if we're going to reflect God rightly, well, then we're going to be creative and wise in the way that we exercise authority. Now, we started off this year, we've been in a series on human purpose, why God has created the world. And we started off the series by talking about how God has created us to reflect him, right? We are created for his glory, to reflect his glory. We're made in his image. We've looked at the ways that we reflect God, right? We reflect him in the way we relate to one another, to him, to the world. We've talked about the ways that we reflect God in our dependence on him, or the way that we reflect God in our rhythms of work. Last week we looked at rest. These are all ways that we reflect God. But this morning, we're going to look at another way that we reflect God, and it's by how we rule, by how we adopt this vocation of wisely ruling over the world that God has given us. Yes, sometimes that calling to rule goes wrong, but we're going to go ahead and jump in and see what it means for us. So God created us. Number one, God created us to rule over the creation wisely. Now, I just want you to notice there is a hierarchy in this passage. There's no secret here. We're supposed to rule over the fish, the birds, and the earth. Look at verses 28 and 29 again. Just 28. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every creature that crawls on the earth." So we have authority, right? It's right there in the text. I mean, God says, subdue the earth. Rule over the creation. See, this is the privilege that comes with being blessed by God and being made in his image. We are the stewards of creation because we bear the image of the Creator. But I want you to realize it's not just a privilege. It's also a massive responsibility. To have authority is a great honor, but that honor, well, it comes with responsibility. We are to care for the world that we've been given. We are like God in that we have been given authority, and we're also to be like God in how we use that authority. If we're going to reflect God, we're going to use that authority in wise and loving ways. Now, before we go any further, I just want to make sure that we can correct some misperceptions here that we may have because of where we are culturally today. We've got to let the Bible correct some of our sensibilities here. In the United States, we have a built-in bias toward authority. Okay, it's we've got a little bit of that don't tread on me sensibility, that it's kind of like, that authority, a lot of people in our society think authority is just always a bad thing. Or at best, it's a necessary evil. You got to put up with it, but it's really not good. We like to think of the world as more democratic, where power is equally shared, where everybody tries to minimize authority as much as possible. And you know this from a lot of our cultural heroes that you find in movies and TV shows and books. Oftentimes, our heroes are the rebels against authority in one way or another. We tend to see authority in a negative light. But the Bible doesn't share that sentiment. It really doesn't. Now, to be fair, the Bible has a lot to say about unjust authority, about the abuse of authority, and the world has known its fair share of bad authorities, and we'll get to the reason for why that is the case here in a minute. But the fact that the abuse of authority exists, well, that's one of the primary reasons that the idea of authority in general can rub you the wrong way, especially if you've ever been in a really authoritarian type scenario. Then it's understandable why you might not like the idea of authority at all, right? Stick it to the boss, right? Like that tends to be our mindset. But the Bible doesn't agree that power in and of itself is a corrupt thing, or that authority in and of itself is bad. In fact, the Bible sees authority as good, as necessary for human beings to flourish. So authority in the workplace, when it's working properly, when it's not in a domineering fashion, well, authority in the workplace ought to make work better for everybody there. It ought to make things better, not worse. Authority in the home should also be set up to maximize human flourishing. See, having someone be in charge is not in and of itself a bad thing. Authority in the government when things are working properly, which lately they rarely are, but when they are, it's not just a necessary evil, it's a positive good. It's to be a positive force for good in the world. Listen, a parent who exercises authority is not doing something wrong. A parent's doing something right. Now, I know a lot of times people talk about parenting these days as, our children just need us to be a friend. No, sometimes our children need us to be the parent, to guide, to direct, to use that authority. Listen, a parent who exercises authority isn't doing something wrong, they're doing something right. That's what it means to parent. Authority, you see, is not the opposite of love. Authority is often an expression of love. It's a privilege and a responsibility. So I want just to make sure you understand, when we talk about authority this morning, that we have authority, and you saw this, that as humans over the earth, we are to subdue the earth. We're not advocating the scourging of the earth or the destruction of wildlife or the advancement of the economy, no matter the environmental consequences. No, when we talk about authority, we're talking about stewardship, about the privilege and the responsibility that comes with leading, with caring, with ruling. A good and wise king is not one who abuses his authority over his subjects, but exercises his authority for the good of the whole kingdom. That's what it means to be a good king. So don't miss what the Bible is saying here. Authority is a good thing. And listen, all of us as human beings have received a measure of it. We all have some sphere of influence, some measure of authority. Look at, you see the first signs of authority in Genesis 2:19, when Adam names the animals. See what Adam's doing there? It's creative work. He's coming up with names for the animals. It's authoritative work, because the animals will now have the name he has authoritatively bestowed upon them, right? So Adam explored the variety of animals in God's good world, and he categorized them and he named them. And this is an example of bringing order, further order to this creation, this wonderful creation. So there is a creative aspect to this kind of authority. We are called to model the creativity of our God. One of the ways that we exercise, that we reflect God in this way, is that we create stuff. I mean, think about the great inventions of the world. Perhaps the most influential person in the last 1,000 years would be Gutenberg, because of the invention of the printing press and just how that changed the world. Or we think of other inventions. You think of like some of the more famous ones, like Alexander Graham Bell. Did you know that he gave us the telephone, but also the air conditioning? I don't know about you. I know that Bell is more famous for giving us the telephone, but I would go without my phone to have air conditioning. I would just say. But it's not just him. I mean, you've got Thomas Edison, who finally got the light bulb to work. The Wright brothers, the first to fly. Henry Ford invented the car. Al Gore invented the internet. No, just kidding on that last one. But just think about it. As human beings, we reflect God by our exercise of authority in how we cultivate creation and in what we create. And up until now, I've been talking about exploration and practical inventions, but just think about the wonder and the joy and the beauty that comes from some of the artistic creations that are out there. You think of Mozart, Handel, who composed the Messiah, or like the great composers like Beethoven and Vivaldi and Tchaikovsky and the Beatles, when you really think about all of these wonderful ways in which people make something of the world and create and give us amazing songs. And think about films, great filmmakers or writers who've given us, we've got the world of Narnia, for example, because C.S. Lewis invented this world. Or you've got the mythology of Middle Earth because of the brilliance of a J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Or you think of the great poets and the great chefs and the great fashions, even the idea of interior decorating. See, just think about how boring the world would be if people didn't fulfill this purpose for which we were created, to create things. And I think everyone in here at some point, you could probably point to something that you made yourself, right? Maybe you wrote a poem or a song, or you knitted something, or you worked on a house, or you rebuilt a car. Just this week, my 10-year-old son, he's in 5th grade, David, came to me and he read me this story that he is writing. And I told him, I was like, I'm gonna tell Fairview Church about that story that you're writing. He said, no, Dad, it's not just a story, it's gonna be a book. because it's got chapters. And he does. He's got like multiple chapters. He's already writing out. And so I went up into the upstairs closet where I have a big box of stuff from when I was a kid, and I got out something that I wrote when I was his age. And I was like, here's a story I wrote when I was your age. But I was telling him, look, you made something. Like this character that you created, this story you created, it didn't exist before you made it. Right? So there's all of this creation that we're involved with. And this is one of the beautiful things about being human. And this is how God looks at his creation as well. He looks at us people and all of our colors, our sizes, our personalities. And God looks down at the diversity of his creation. And I think God's proud of what he's made. Just, that there's that amazing scene in the book of Job, at the end of the book of Job, when God is talking with Job. What does he point to? He points to all of the amazing animals that he's created. He talks about the mountains and the seas. It's like God is just filled with joy and awe at his own power, saying, don't you see? This is my creation. I love it. I'm proud of it all. And listen, when God looks at you, he says the same thing. I love you. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You are my creation. And God charges us to take that task farther along, to reflect him by creating things ourselves. So we were created to create, to cultivate culture, to spread human culture by creating and inventing and painting and building. Isn't that wonderful? But that's only half the story, though. Because so many times our creative authority goes wrong. Often we leave the world a bigger mess than we found it. The Bible has a good explanation of why that is the case, too. Number 2, it's because of sin that we abuse our authority over creation and each other. See, the Bible teaches us why things go wrong, why authority gets abused, why things we create can wreak havoc in the world instead of just make things better. Sin has corrupted our ability to create. Instead of creating things that lead to life and glory and beauty, we create things that can lead to horror. And we see this in Genesis. Just a few chapters after God gives Adam and Eve the purpose of creating culture, what do we see people doing? They're raising up a Tower of Babel. Right? They're trying to be like God. Our ancient ancestors took this mandate of creating and cultivating the world, and instead of doing this as a way of reflecting God and as a testament to his glory, they decided to make a name for themselves. And even today, our attempts at creating stuff go wrong. It's amazing to think about the technological advances in the past century, right? Just amazing, the leaps and bounds by which things have grown. But also consider that many of the technological inventions that have come about in the last 120 years or so led to the destruction and the killing of more people in the last century than in all other wars in human history combined. In one century. So technological advance can be amazing, but there's also this downside. So, just think about the amazing invention of the internet, but think of all the things the internet has been turned to bad use for. The spreading of child pornography, or you think about the bullying that happens or whatnot, or there's all sorts of debates even now about how detrimental some social media may be for mental health and whatnot. So you've got a creation that is good. Listen, sin and corruption is never far away. And because of sin, even our best efforts at creating something can be twisted into something horrible. Sin has affected our purpose, the way that we were created to rule with wisdom and creativity. And instead of reigning, we want to dominate. We desire authority, which, again, is not a bad thing. But our desire for authority gets twisted into that maniacal pursuit of control, being in control. Because of sin, we're tempted usually in one of two directions. We either abuse our authority or we abandon our authority. And both of those are problems. The abuse of authority is when you lord your title over someone else. You squash someone under you. The abandonment of authority is when you fail to lead in the ways you've been called to. Like when you're passive as parents, or when we're passive in how we lead people in the workplace. When we've been given authority and we fail to use it to make the decision, to live with the pressure, that's abandonment. And listen, whether it's the abuse of authority or the abandonment of authority, both of those lead to terrible consequences. There's a scene in Mark chapter 10 where Jesus took the disciples aside and he's set up a contrast between the world's way of leading and his way of leading. The disciples had been debating who was the greatest among themselves. Like, how do we fit in this hierarchy of relationships? And it's kind of easy to chuckle at them, like all grappling at, for a position, but don't we do the same thing? I mean, it's just we may do it online or in social media or maybe in conversations or, we're all trying to demonstrate our greatness. We all want to show that, jockeying for these positions of power, that we're the ones in control. And Jesus says, listen, the way the world uses authority against people is not the way we are to exercise authority. Instead, we are to serve. Look at what he said, verse 42 of chapter 10. Jesus called them over and said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So as the Church of Jesus Christ, we are called to show the world around us that people have been created to rule, but not the way the world sees rulership and authority. We don't rule from personal interests. We were created to rule by seeking to fulfill the wishes to have the people that we're ruling over flourish underneath us. Do you see the difference? Some people want to be in charge as a way of gaining things. They want to be great. Others use their positions of authority as a way of making the world a better place, of helping everyone, not just those with power. And Jesus wants us to be the kinds of people who serve, who rule with humble authority. You say, well, I don't really know that I have the opportunity to do that very much. Listen, almost everyone in here has some sphere of influence or authority. Everyone in here has been tasked at some level with this kind of authority. Maybe you're a leader, maybe you're not. Maybe you don't see yourself as a leader, but maybe you teach children, or you have influence at home, or maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a supervisor at work. You just have to broaden your imagination a bit to see those areas where God has given you the opportunity to exercise authority, whether it's a small sphere or a large sphere. And you've got to ask the question, do you rule with the love of God? Or do you rule like the world? When people talk about the way you use your authority, what do they see? Are they always resentful? Do you make their lives a nightmare, or do they respect you because you rule with dignity and humility? You treat them well. What kind of authority do you have, and how will you exercise it? This is an important question because it's an important part of our purpose as human beings. You see that all the way back in Genesis. It's an aspect of our life that's being redeemed by Jesus. We see that in the Gospel of Mark. But now I want us to go to the closing chapters of the Bible because it's also our destiny. It's not just our origin, it's also our destiny. Because of Christ, humanity's reign is reestablished. Look with me at Revelation 5, 9, and 10. It says, and they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slaughtered and you purchased people for God by your blood from every tribe and language and people and nation. You made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign on the earth. We will reign on the earth. The Bible teaches that death reigned through Adam, but life reigns through Jesus. And one day, the whole creation will be restored. And this passage gives us just a little glimpse of what that's going to be like. We will reflect the glory of God in how we rule wisely over the world. The creation will be restored. Jesus will oversee a kingdom of priests, a kingdom of rulers. No more sinful stains, no more selfishness, no more abuse of authority, no more abandonment of authority. Co-heirs with Christ, we will reign with him on the new earth. That's what Scripture teaches. So our destiny is to rule with Jesus. So I want to ask us some practical questions now. How do we live in light of that future? Like, how do we anticipate that day right now? And I want to give you 3 words and point you to 2 of them that don't get as much attention as I think they should. Every day we have the opportunity to either consume something, to cultivate something, or to create something, okay? And our society is built around consuming, when we really need to be giving more attention to things we may cultivate or create. Here's what I mean. Let me give you a little bit of definition for those words. So when I say consuming, I'm talking about the passive reception of entertainment. Like, as consumers, we spend time entertaining ourselves. And it may be through video games, television shows, movies, scrolling on social media through, YouTube shorts or Instagram reels, whatever it might be. But you know what I'm talking about. These are just the activities that demand very little of us. It's just passive. We're just kind of taking in. And listen, there's nothing wrong with consuming. We've talked a lot about different music we listen to or TV shows and things. Even I started the sermon talking about TV shows that we like. So there's nothing wrong with consumption. But I want to point to two other words that we should be thinking about. The next word is to cultivate something, cultivating. And what I mean by that is the intentional development of something. As cultivators, we engage in something that makes a demand on us. It can be developing your mind through reading and study. It could be cultivating a skill or a hobby. Maybe you're restoring a car. Maybe you're learning to play a musical instrument. Maybe you're working out in the garden. What I mean by cultivating is there's going to be some kind of either mental or physical exertion in making something of the world. And if you cultivate enough, it's interesting, but that will actually cultivate you. Actually kind of changes you into the kind of person who develops things, who makes things. So that's cultivating. But then there's a third word, it also starts with C, and that's creating something. And that's when you invent something that didn't exist before. You make something of the world. You leave something behind. You focus your attention on a particular artifact, right, that others may benefit from. Maybe it's a piece of music or a poem or a story or an article. You paint a portrait or something. Now, my point with those three words is that we live in a society that pushes us constantly toward consumption. Consume, consume, consume. Not creation, not cultivation. In fact, a lot of times we think that, cultivating, creating, that sounds hard. That sounds like work. Consumption is just rest. We've got to change that picture in our mind. Because actually, cultivating and creating can bring just as much joy, if not more, as consumption. You know, you can learn to actually enjoy the process of cooking as much as you enjoy the meal at the end of it. You can enjoy the yard work as much as you enjoy sitting out on the patio on a late summer afternoon, enjoying the smell of the fresh cut grass, you know? You can enjoy the planting of flowers as much as you begin to enjoy looking at those and seeing the beauty of those flowers. My point is that we've got to train ourselves to find joy in creating and cultivating when the world will tell you that really it's all the joy you could find is really in just consuming and consuming. And in order to train ourselves that way, we've got to make the decision. When faced with a choice day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, to consume, to cultivate, or create, there are going to be times we're going to have to say, I'm only consuming up to a point, but now it's time for me to set that aside and for me to cultivate something. Now it's time for me to develop something. Now it's time for me to create something. If we do that, we as Christians will stand out in a world that is so focused on just taking in and passively receiving. We'll stand out because we'll be the ones making great art. We'll be the ones that are making something of the world. We'll be the kind of people who actually enjoy the exertion that cultivation and creation takes. Listen, human beings were created to rule. We squandered that calling because of our sin. But that vocation, ruling wisely over the earth, that can be restored because of one man who did for us what we failed to do for ourselves. That man is Jesus. You know, whenever we sing about Jesus as our Lord, Jesus is our King, you know what we're saying? We're saying, this is the one. This is the man who fulfills God's original design for humanity. This is the one who rules wisely over the world. This is the one who succeeded where Adam failed. This is the one to whom our knees bow and our tongues confess that he is Lord. And you know the crazy thing about the King we worship was that his throne was a cross. That's how he ruled. He came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the kind of leadership that Jesus exercised. He is both the suffering servant and the conquering king. We call him the servant king. And in that paradox, we see the glory of what God always intended for his people, that we would lead and serve, that we would rule and submit, that we would subdue and cultivate. And because of the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have the promise of new life, the restoration of our original purpose. Listen, I know this morning we've covered a lot of ground. We've gone all the way from Genesis, making a stop in Job and in the Gospels, and got all the way to Revelation. I want you to think, though, as Christians, we may have to reconsider the ways in which we've exercised our authority. Maybe ways we've abandoned our posts when we needed to be there, or maybe ways we've abused our authority. We've exercised authority in wrong ways, to repent of that, to want to change that, to really lead out in serving. If you're here and you're not a Christian, I want to give you an opportunity this morning to give your life to Jesus, the servant king who gave his life for you, the one who shows us who God is, what God is like. The prayer room will be open. We would love to talk with you about what it means to give your life to this king and then to submit to his rule for your joy, for his glory.